I just want to really deal briefly with two issues that I think highlight very well the bankruptcy of the EU at the moment as an institution, and that actually expose the nature of this organisation, which really has been established and operates in the interests of European big business, and in that sense has little to offer ordinary European citizens, no matter where they reside. And that's really the issue of the developing disaster in the Ukraine, and then briefly the issue of GM crops, which is sadly alive and flourishing on the EU agenda at the moment. And I think both of these areas are going to have lasting consequences on the lives, health and well-being of European citizens. Now, I have to say, in terms of the tragedy in the Ukraine, that I believe it's a consequence not just of the failure of the EU in terms of offering a solution there, but also as a direct result of some of the antics of the EU in that region, along with their colleagues and friends in the United States intervening for their own economic and military gain, and really to hell with the consequences. Now, as a result of that, obviously yesterday we had the ending of the 10-day ceasefire by Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president, and his ordering of troops and forces to attack pro-Russian separatists, and a sharp intensification of fighting in eastern Ukraine, which I think is highly regrettable, although we would have to say that there wasn't much of a ceasefire in existence in any way, with both sides accusing the other of ignoring the situation on the ground, and many fatalities and atrocities being carried out in the course of that alleged ceasefire, such as the killing of the Russian journalist on Sunday evening, travelling on a bus along with Ukrainian mothers going to visit their sons who were conscripts in the army in that area. And I think it gives a good insight into the difficulties that are there. We see a sharp increase in the number of civilians that are allegedly being wounded, and an escalation of shelling by government forces. Now, I think it is a little bit ironic that these calling off of the ceasefire, it was the Russian delegation who argued for the ceasefire to continue, but the EU responded by calling on Russia and demanding that it would implement sanctions against Russia, while standing by and not making the same call in terms of Poroshenko himself. Now, of course, the EU is saying that, but there are very different interests at the helm of the EU. The US obviously wants harsher sanctions against Russia, while Germany needs Russia on side, particularly because of its energy needs in that area. But it is clear that the situation is a right mess, and the only thing we can say with certainty is that it's ordinary citizens, whether they reside in the east or in the west, who are the ones who are losing out on this. And it is an absolute disaster, because while I think nobody here would have any truck with Yanukovych or his ousted regime, nonetheless it was an elected government which the West facilitated to undermine and replace with an ultra right-wing, similar in some ways, another billionaire oligarch who is in control at the moment. And I don't welcome the signing of the EU Association Agreement, because I don't think it's going to deliver anything for the people of Ukraine. Quite the opposite. In fact, it's going to contribute to a massive deterioration in living standards in that regime. It is accompanied by IMF austerity against the backdrop of a very difficult economic situation, a 50% drop in the currency value, huge unemployment, huge economic difficulties in that area, and relaxing and slashing import tariffs from the EU is not going to assist that situation. Already you've seen certain retaliatory gestures from Russia, who are Ukraine's biggest export market. And in the middle of all of this, while the oligarchs at the top battle for control, it's the people on the bottom who are suffering in terms of their wages and their living standards. And meanwhile, obviously, the threat of war and that escalation is sharply continuing. And I think it's a little bit ironic that while, on the one hand, the EU talks about the Russian threat, that really the moves of Russia are very understandable, given the way NATO has basically encircled them up to the border, have in effect taken over the Caucasus and moved very much in. And the reality is that Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine do feel very vulnerable. They represent a sizable part of the population and have long sought a democratic federation that reflects the ethnic diversity in the region. But what's happening now is actually serving to unravel that and make that worse. I think, as John Pilger described it, that these people are not separatists nor rebels, he said, but citizens who want to live securely in their homeland. And I think that's the situation facing most Ukrainians, no matter what side they're on. And in that sense, that's what we should be reflecting as a neutral country, intervening into the situation rather than taking sides, which we're continuing to do. And I just want to quote from a sociologist in Kiev who describes the situation to me very, very well. And he says, rather than constructing hypocritical justifications for why military suppression of some armed protesters is better than military suppression of other armed protesters, why the pro-Ukrainian far right is better than the pro-Russian far right, why the Ukrainian neoliberal government is better than the Russian neoliberal government, or why we're ready to fight Russian imperialism but accept Western imperialist interests in the Ukraine. It would be better to support the progressive wings on both sides, unite them against the ruling class, against nationalism and imperialism with shared demands for social justice. And to me, that is the way forward, and that's a voice which Ireland, as a neutral country, should be championing around the EU table. But sadly, we prefer to coattail the EU establishment and, behind the scenes, the US establishment as well. Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. I think the other issue which is going to have a lasting impact is the issue of GM crops. Now, I'm aware that Ireland voted against the introduction of GM corn in February, but I think later on Minister Hogan took a more ambivalent position, welcoming the fact that under the new arrangement countries could opt out, and therefore sort of implying that it was basically okay. I don't accept that viewpoint. I think Ireland has been very ambivalent and non-committal in terms of its approach on this very important issue. I think that's reflected by the fact that we have allowed the GM trial, potato trial in Carlow, and I don't think it's good enough, because opting out is not really an option in a Europe where the board countries are side by side with each other. Cross-border contamination is a very, very real issue, and the impact can't be confined in that sense to national borders. Ministers are aware that a lot of the anti-GM groups have described the latest deal as being seriously flawed, and even that the legalities of the national opt-outs are highly questionable. So I do think the Minister should do more on this. I'd like to see Ireland opposing it when it goes before the Parliament, because it's going to have an enormously damaging impact on our agriculture unless we speak out on this.
Thank you, Deputy.